From the outside, the castle appears strong and secure, stone walls, towers, and loopholes. But in winter, it becomes a heat trap. Thick walls don't keep you warm. They keep you cold inside. The drafts hit the stairs, and the hearth doesn't even warm the hall. People sleep with their clothes on. They live in niches behind curtains closer to their bodies and warmth. The hearth warms only in front of them. The rest is darkness and dampness. Survival here is not in the architecture, but in the little things. A skin on your shoulders, hot porridge in a bowl, a dog at your feet. This is not a grand castle. This is a winter inside with stone and smoke and silence. Do you think living in a castle in winter means coziness by the fireplace and feasts in the halls? What if there is only one fireplace? The floor is stone, the walls are icy, and the window blows out like a battlefield. Watch this video to the end, and you'll find out how you really survived in medieval castles. When winter turned the fortress into a stone trap. Stone doesn't bend, doesn't creak, it doesn't burn. It protects from arrows, from battering rams, from enemies outside. But in winter, it becomes its own enemy, silent, still relentless. It spares no one. He stores the cold like a cannonball and disperses it inside. Thick walls of castles, 152 in cross-section, were created not for comfort, but for war, for defense. And the thicker they are, the slower they warm up, and the longer it takes them to give up their icy breath inside. Even if the flame in the hearth burns all day, the distance from the fire to the wall is the difference between warmth and death. The stone soaks up the cold in the fall. It holds it until spring. It doesn't warm it, remembers winter. If you put your palm on it, it burns with an icy touch, and not for a minute, but for hours. And if you sleep against the wall, you're sick. If you sit against the wall, you get cold. If you breathe against the wall, you breathe into nothing. The front hall's reception rooms, staircases, corridors, everything is lined with stone. Sometimes bare, sometimes sheathed, sometimes thinly whitewashed. No internal insulation, no plaster, no brick, just a smooth surface that doesn't hold heat. To keep warm, the walls are draped. They hang heavy fabrics, carpets, bedspreads, skins. In the castles of the nobility, tapestries with hunting heraldry, religious scenes. In poor towers, it's burlap old capes sewn bedspreads. Everything that can be hung is hung not for beauty, but for protection. 14th century sources, especially the inventories of castles in England, France, and Bohemia, mentioned that during the winter season, the number of fabric curtains, tapestries, and shelters made of hides and felt increased in castle halls. They were placed in the corners on the walls, even under the ceiling, to try to seal at least some heat. In Russia and Eastern Europe, moss and soot were used to seal cracks. Sometimes the cracks between stones were sealed with clay and straw, as in village huts, because the technology of military buildings did not take winter into account. They only took into account combat. People knew how to interact with the wall. Never put a bed up close. Never put a sleeper up against a rock. If you can build a wooden partition, if not sleep by the fire. Even at night, even in the dark. Even if you can hear wolves outside, better by the fire than next to a frozen wall. Stone was not persuaded. It was accepted as an enemy, but an enemy to live within. It was not fought against. It was warded off with cloth, with the body, with furniture, with prayer. Watch the video to the end and you'll learn how the most dangerous cold lurked behind an impregnable wall. How a castle that could withstand a siege didn't always survive January. And how knights, barons, and peasants alike hid from the stone. A wall that didn't care who died next to it. When you enter the castle hall, the first thing you don't see, but hear, the emptiness hums. A footstep echoes. A voice drifts upwards. The flames crackle and disappear into the heights. This is not just a room. It is a stone throat into which heat disappears. The halls were built for power, for presentation, for feasts and audiences. The whole clan, the whole retinue, all the guests were to be accommodated in them. But in winter, this hall became a stone trap. Greatness became a burden. Every cubic meter of air was a new enemy for the fire. The hearth in the center of the hall was a symbol of the hearth of family clan home. It had been burning since morning, giving off light smoke sparks, but it was not enough. It heated a narrow circle at most 2 or 3 meters from the heat. Beyond that, everything belonged to the cold air again. The flame didn't rise above his waist. My head was freezing when my feet were warm. Later here's began to be replaced by fireplaces. They were built into the walls, hoods were installed, and chimneys were added. Fireplaces became an attribute of noble chambers. But even then, the whole hall was not heated. The stone from which the walls were built drew in heat and did not return it. Heat hung over the fireplace, and frost hung in the corners. The architects of the Middle Ages knew this. They zoned space. Inside the hall, they created rooms within rooms. Fabric screens, drapes, carpets, furniture, partitions. Behind them, people slept, ate, prayed. This was not an interior design solution. It was a heat retention system. The floor was covered with straw, not carpet. Carpets froze. The straw kept a layer of air. It was changed, replenished, sometimes even put on the table. The walls were covered with dense fabrics, skins, embroidered panels, and not for aesthetics. It was to stop the draft, to stop the air from walking around the hall. Historical documents, including reports on the maintenance of royal residences, England, France, Bohemia, describe the purchases. 20 Arsonians of cloth to drape the hall skins for curtains, double canopies for the windows, because without these layers, the hall was deathly cold. People didn't live in the hall. They lived around the flames, by the hearth, by the brazier, by the fireplace. Tables were placed close to the fire. They slept on benches against the wall under a canopy. No one stood in the center of the room for long. They didn't wait there. They were cold there. Chroniclers' letters mention how ladies sat wrapped in 3 furine capes and still complained that the ink froze on the parchment. Servants worked with leather mittens. Horses brought inside at the siege heated the hall better than the hearth. Halls were built tall, not to keep them warm, but to impress. They held power, but they did not hold heat. And everyone who lived within those walls knew that closer to the fire, closer to life. In a cold castle, heat is uneven. It doesn't flood the room like steam. It clings to surfaces, to bodies, to fabric. It's small. It's thin, brittle. It's trapped, hidden, held. No one lives in the center of the hall. The center is the display, the expanse, a symbol of power. But in winter, it's a bare space. The floor there is the coldest, the drafts, the strongest, the sound, the emptiest. Life shifts to the borders, into the depths, into corners, into niches, into the shadows between the wall and the fireplace. Medieval castle dwellers, they knew where to sit, not out of habit, but out of survival. Against the wall, but not against the wall itself, between the column and the recess. In a niche padded with skins under the stairs, where it doesn't blow in a chair with high sides behind which there is already a fabric screen. Woolen curtains were drawn along the walls, double curtains at the entrance, thick ones at the windows, and in the halls, huge cuts of cloth dividing the hall into quarters. Behind them, they put benches, chairs, with fur bedding roasters with coals. These were not decorative corners, but shelters, temporary, fragile, but they gave a chance to hold out. Archaeological studies of castles in York, Cardiff, Beaumaris, and Königsberg confirmed the existence of special fixtures in the walls and ceilings for screens and fabric partitions. They were changed, removed, moved as needed, like walls that can be carried away. The huge armchairs that have survived to this day often had high sides, not only for status, but also for warmth. Inside such a chair, the body warmed faster. The air would accumulate, the candle would warm the cat on your lap, would add some more living heat. Sometimes curtains were even hung around the bed in the hall. Such sleeping places were like tents on a catwalk, surrounded by cloth on all sides. They were not chambers, but a warm capsule. And in this capsule, one slept clothed with one's hands clasped together, covered not with a blanket, but with whatever one had. Even the candles were arranged in a special way. Not in the center, but closer to the corners where there was cloth, where it was tight, where the bodies wouldn't let the heat out, where one candle could raise the temperature a couple of degrees. In a niche with three, you could feel the sensitivity of your fingers returning. Servants, guards, guests, everyone was looking for these points. It didn't matter if you were a baron or a cook. If you wanted to get warm, look for a corner. Look for the shade from the cloth, the warmth from the wall, the residual heat in the seat. The halls at this time of year turned into a chessboard. Cold squares, warm spots, and everyone moving along their routes to stay warm. Some castles, especially in France and northern Germany, even had special warm rooms inside the halls, with double drapes, roasters, carpets, podiums. One could enter these rooms out of the cold, sit for 10 minutes, and return to business. Anything that could create an isolated volume became a chance. Anything that could hold your breath was used. It doesn't matter how tight it is. All that mattered was that there was no draft. The candle didn't go out. Breath doesn't float. There was no central heating in the castle. And even the fireplaces, rare and capricious, did not warm the hall, but the air near the flames. When the embers went out and the wind blew in the hallway, the body became the only source of heat. Anything that could keep that heat going was not a luxury. It was a necessary element of survival. Clothing in a winter castle is armor, layered heavy dense. First an undershirt of linen or hemp, then a woolen tunic on top. On top of the tunic, a cloak. On top of the cloak, a fur cape. On the head, a woolen hood, and over it a leather or fur hood. It's all tied, wrapped, sealed, no gaps. The cold looks for gaps, and the clothes plug them. Hands are covered with mittens or sleeves. Feet are covered with double-one straw-filled boots. It is a risk to go to bed without shoes. In the morning, you could not slip your foot in. The boot would harden from frost, even if it stood against the wall. That's why they slept in it. The bedchamber is a fortress inside the castle. In the nobility, it is raised on a wooden podium enclosed by 4 pillars. It's not an aesthetic. It's a fabric room within a room. A baldish slides down, covering the bed on all sides. Behind it is warmth. It is created by the body breath, fur, and feather bed. A feather bed is a bag of wool, down hay, or old rags. The thicker, the better. On top, blankets, several sewn from scraps, wool fur, often double with inner filling. The warmest one is on top. Sometimes a skin, sometimes dog, goat, fox. A stone heated by the hearth, or a ceramic vessel with hot coals was placed under the feather bed. It was wrapped in a cloth and pressed against the feet. Sometimes it was placed under a blanket for half an hour before lying down. The main thing was to warm the middle of the bed. We slept in our clothes almost always, not because there was no place to change, but because to undress was to freeze. Even in wealthy castles, sleeping clothes are the same as day clothes, only slightly looser on the chest. Sometimes they just put another shirt on top. Servants and guards slept by the doors, by the walls, on benches. Their bed is straw, a woolen sack, a bundle of old cloth. They cover themselves with cloaks, sacks, lay their skins directly on the stone, and still they wake up with a shiver, with a clang of teeth, with the fact that a bone has woken up. In some castles, for example, in the Tower Kenilworth Loch Special Chamber, Chamber's small rooms built inside large halls were arranged for royalty. Their walls were draped. The ceiling was lowered to make it easier to heat. There stood the best beds, with the thickest curtains heated by braziers with coals. But even there, the temperature rarely exceeded 110. Inventories of the first 15th centuries from the castles of France, England, Bohemia, and Poland mention 2 pillows with wool, a coverlet of foxskins, curtains of double cloth, woolen canopy, curtains to the floor, cloth, sheets. This is not a luxury. It is a necessity. We shared a bed often in 2s and 3s, not out of love, out of calculation. The warmth of a body doesn't dissipate when another body's near. Mothers sleep with their children, servants 2 at a time. Sometimes they let a dog under the blanket. It is warmer than many, because there is no silence in the castle, but there is cold. And while you sleep, the only thing holding life together is layered cloth armor on you and over you. In the castle, winter rises from the floor, not from the windows, not from the ceiling, but from below, from the very foundation. The stone on which the entire castle stands is soaked with moisture. Cold time. It doesn't age, it doesn't crack, it doesn't crumble. But it's eternally cold even in August, and in winter it becomes part of the weather. The floors of castles are not planks, carpets, or clay. They are massive slabs of stone, most often limestone, sandstone, or rough cobblestone. They are laid tightly, but not tightly. Between them are seams, cracks, thin tunnels for air. The building itself breathes through them. Cold seeps upward. Moisture stays in the stone for 24 hours. Even if the floor is warm during the day, it's icy again at night. It stinks. It makes your knees freeze. It gives birth to diseases that have no names, only cures with broth and skins. Inside the corridors and passages, the cold walks, like the wind. The drafts are no small thing. It's a river. The air flows across the floor, up staircases, around columns, flooding bedrooms, kitchens, chapels. Sometimes it's insensible, but when you sit down, the cold creeps under your clothes. In order to survive, people made planks, straw reeds, dried stalks, sometimes just old burlap. This layer absorbed moisture. The flow of air created at least a weak layer between the foot and the stove. Sometimes they put cloth on top, thin but dense, sometimes skins. Wooden podiums were installed in the halls and private chambers. It was the floor above the floor. Furniture stood on it, and people ate, slept, and worked there. Such a podium was not a sign of luxury, but of understanding. If you slept on a stone, you would fall asleep overnight. The corners of the room are especially dangerous. Moisture accumulated there. That's where the air was blowing from under the walls. That's why beds were not placed close to the corners. Benches were pushed back. They put thick boards, planks, even rods under the walls, anything that could hold back the flow. Sometimes they put rolls stuffed with soot between the wall and the floor. Historical inventories of French and English castles of the 14th and 15th centuries, including Windsor, Carnarvon, and Ambay, contain references to purchases of reeds and straw for flooring cloth, for door curtains and doormats for refactories. These are not decorations. They are a system of insulation. A damp floor could kill a man in 2 nights. Doorways and arched openings became channels of draft. The arches that connected the towers and halls, the staircases leading to the courtyard, the gates, all these were the open mouths of the castle. The wind traveled through them like a corridor, drawing the last degrees of heat from the bedroom. To stop this flow, the openings were covered with cloth. The cloth was hung on ropes nailed to the jambs, tied with ropes, sometimes in 2 layers, sometimes with clay or metal weights at the bottom to keep it from swaying. The curtain in front of the door was not a decorative element, but the only wall that could be hung. Internal boxes. Wooden vestibules were built in the passages between the buildings. This allowed at least some air retention. And if there was no vestibule, a portable screen made of wood and fabric was put up. No one went barefoot, not even the children, not even at night. The shoes were made of straw hemp wool. The boots were put by the hearth. If they left them against the wall, they could be broken like ice in the morning. People weren't sitting on the floor on anything above it. A bench, a jug, another person's knee, anything to stay below the hip. Because the closer you get to the stone, the closer you get to winter. Watch the video to the end, and you'll learn how a castle built for strength kept the most vulnerable weakness inside. The floor, how the stone on which the tower stood, stole heat every day, and how the straw underfoot became not a covering, but a shield between body and death. Light in a castle in winter is a weak luxury. It costs too much, not in silver and degrees. Every ray of sunlight that makes its way in comes with the cold. And so as soon as frost sets in, the window ceases to be a source of light. It becomes the enemy. It must be shut closed, boarded up. Glass was rare in early medieval castles. Even in the wealthy residences of kings and lords, windows were often left open because glass was fragile, expensive, and ineffective. Instead, they used mica, a layered mineral, translucent like ice scales, or thin sheets of horn, boiled and polished to translucency. Sometimes bull bladders stretched over a frame and dried. The light through such windows was murky, diffuse yellowish, but they did at least somehow shield the room from the wind. And yet even this level of transparency was accessible only to those who lived in the upper halls, kitchens, warehouses, corridors, staircases, service quarters, remained with open apertures. When winter came, all the windows were shut, not just the ones without horns or mycica. All of them, even the ones with some light, because even a ray is a crack, and a crack is a draft. The locks used shutters, internal and external. The outer shutters were usually oak thick on hinges with iron fasteners. They were closed in the evening and not opened at all in winter. The inner ones were lighter, often with latches or cross bolts. Moss hemp and cloth were stuffed between them. Wooden shields, rectangular boards cut to the shape of the window were hung on the inside. In poorer rooms, they were simply leaned on and pressed down with a stone or a sack. In better appointed rooms, they were attached to nails or hinges hammered into the wall. The windows were covered with curtains, not decorative, but dense, made of coarse cloth or sackcloth, to increase protection. Sometimes old cloaks, hides, and canvas from wagons were used. Everything that could be hung, sewn, fastened was used. In rooms without shutters, the windows were covered. Clay and straw boards nailed together. Sometimes they just hammered a board into the opening and covered both sides with cloth. The light went out, but the warmth stayed. Historical records from the castles of Charter Carnarvon Prague Castle and the Tower indicate the seasonal purchase of wood cloth and wax specifically to insulate windows. Even in the royal chambers, windows were shuttered and boarded up. Because the sun was worthless, if it caused the room to freeze, daylight was consciously sacrificed, working by candlelight, riding by the hearth. Kitchens where the heat was high became day rooms, and bedrooms became dark caves. Even the gaps between the wall and the frame were curtained, sometimes with a full-length cloth curtain. The darkness was part of the warmth. It hid the cracks, drew in the air, kept winter out. And everyone who entered a room with the windows closed knew that if it was dark, it meant it was at least a little warmer. Here is the most detailed and rich in domestic and historical detail version of paragraph 7. Food as internal heating, framed in the format of a documentary historical reenactment narrative, focusing on the feeling of survival and real warmth in the conditions of a medieval castle. In winter, it's not the fire, the hide, or the cloak that keeps you warm in the castle. It's the food, hot, dense, fatty. The kind that doesn't just satisfy hunger, it ignites heat from within. In conditions where even a hearth cannot warm a stone, and the walls pull the cold from outside, everything that goes into the mouth must work like a furnace. The body becomes a furnace. And if you put something hot in it, it will live to see the next dawn. Medieval cooking in the winter season is not about aesthetics, but strategy. Food is cooked not for flavor, not for pleasure, but to keep from shivering at night. Everything that can give warmth goes into the boiler. Porridge peas, lentils, chickpeas. Boil for a long time until it's a thick mass, sometimes with chunks of meat, more often with bone broth if you're lucky with fat, if not just salt and warm water. The main thing is that it's hot and hearty. Soup is a luxury. Chowder is a survival tool. Fat is the main gold of winter. It is added to porridge, smeared on bread, melted in wine butter, lard bone marrow. It's not just calories. It's an internal fuel that keeps the heat in longer than clothes, especially at night when the hearth dies out and the body's left alone in the damp air. Spices in a castle in winter are not decoration. It's a medicine and a stimulant. Pepper, ginger, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg. All this stimulates blood flow, increases metabolism, literally ignites the blood in the veins. Wine sauces, hot beer with spices, spicy porridge. All this warmed me, even if it tasted harsh and unfamiliar. Chronicles of monasteries and castles of the 13th and 14th centuries record an increase in the number of hot dishes and the frequency of cooking meat precisely during the winter months. Inventory records often mention pork fat for 40 dinners, clay pots with bone broth, bags of spices given to the kitchen in January. In the refectory halls, food was served steaming. The bowl in front of you is more than just food. It's a small hearth. Steam rises in your face. The spoon warms your fingers. The hot wine is breath. People don't come to the table for food. They come for heat, for a chance to warm up for at least half an hour, for the nobility feast turned into an act of collective heating. In one hall, dozens of candles. Fireplaces and braziers burned. Meat smokes, cauldrons, boiled bread is served. Between everyone is the living warmth of bodies and flames. This is not an ostentatious luxury. It is a method of survival and a stone box. The servants are more modest. Porridge bread, occasional meat, but it's hot. It's handed out by the kitchen, sometimes in their hands, wrapped in cloth to keep it warm. They eat it quickly while it's still warm. Sometimes leftovers are used as a heating pad, hot bread. Under clothes, a bag of porridge to the stomach, a warm stone from the hearth next to the bowl. Even the children were fed more often in winter. Less but warmer hot milk if you have it. Oat water broths, anything to warm the belly from the inside out. Even the rules in the monasteries changed. In winter, 2 hot meals a day were allowed instead of 1, because no one could survive on cold porridge if the walls were stone and the wind was blowing from the window. The castle doesn't get empty in the winter. It shrinks. People, animals heat air. Everything gathers deep inside, closer to the heart of the castle. Not for comfort, for survival, because alone only flames warm. But together, even bodies. The stone walls keep the cold at bay. The hearth warms only in front of it. No glass in the windows. The floors are icy. And the only thing that can raise the temperature of the room, even slightly, is the presence of a living body, or a dozen or 100. In winter, there was no division of functions in the castle. Bakers, guards, squires, servants, maid of honor, children kennels, librarians, jesters, all lived inside the walls together in kitchens, in corridors, in halls, in pantries, in air niches. Everything that could be closed, insulated, curtained was used. They lived tight. 3-5 on one bench, under one skin, in one room. They slept on a pile of straw, cuddled together, covered with whatever they didn't wear during the day. A servant and a squire, a woman with a baby, and a servant girl, an old knight and his dog. Not because of rank, because it's warmer. Even to know didn't sleep alone. They often slept in bed with their spouse children and page boys. A bodyguard, a maid of honor, a trusted servant could be in the chamber. Night was not considered a time of privacy. Night was a time of keeping warm. The huge castle halls breathed with people. Even if there was no hearth in the hall, it was heated by the density of bodies. The more people gathered around a table, the higher the temperature would rise, even without flames, even without light. Just by breathing, by movement, by the heat coming from the skin, animals were also part of this system. Inner rooms were used to house sheep, goats, dogs, cats, sometimes even chickens. They were kept closer to the kitchen in the lower halls, in corners of corridors, under the stairs, in wall niches. The warmth of their bodies raised the air temperature by 2-3 degrees. In a poorly heated space, it was the difference between life and death. Dogs especially, they were put at the foot of the bed, allowed near the children, allowed to warm their bellies. They not only protected, they warmed. Like cats, they were kept not out of love, but out of usefulness, living warmth and silence. Historical sources and inventories of winter life in castles in England, France, Germany, Bohemia, and Russia directly record. All servants were locked in the hall. Goats were left in the kitchen at night. All bodyguards were left at the bedside. This was not the exception, but the practice. The castle in cold weather shrank into a lump. The closer together, the less air between bodies. The warmer it was. Feasts also had a heating function. When dozens of people gathered in one hall, fireplaces, burnt hot food was served, the air was saturated with living warmth. After such gatherings, the hall could retain residual heat until morning. Even corpses were not taken out at once. Sometimes they left them until morning, not because of the ritual, but because the dead body was still warm, and it could save someone else that night. The smell in such rooms was heavy. Soot, sweat, wool, dirt. But no one complained because that smell meant there was life nearby, and that meant a little more warmth. Watch the video to the end, and you'll learn how in a castle, where the walls wouldn't let go of the cold heat, was created not by wood, but by bodies. How solitude was a luxury and crowdedness a necessity. And how survival began with a simple thing, not being alone. In a cold stone castle, fire is not coziness, atmosphere, or decoration. It's power. Fire warms only those closest to it, and closer is always the one higher up the ladder of hierarchy and floors. A fireplace is a rare thing, not because it's hard to build. It's because it requires space, a shaft, a hood, the right air, the right masonry. It doesn't just heat, it breathes. It works with the castle as a system. And if it's not done right, the smoke hangs in the room. You'll burn in an hour. The first fireplaces in Europe appear from the Wartona century, but they do not become a mass element of the interior even in the 14th. A fireplace is a lord's resting place, a mistress's bedroom, a drawing room for receiving envoys, sometimes a chapel, most often one room for the whole floor. A fireplace is always built against a wall, but not against the outer wall so as not to lose heat. Its firebox is wide and deep. Inside there is a row iron grate. On top, a dripstone, a stone face decorated with carving or a coat of arms. It can be beautiful, but in winter it is a shield. A chair is placed by the fireplace, sometimes a massive chair with a high back rest, so that the person sits facing the fire with his back to the room. Not out of pride, out of necessity. The stone behind the back is cold. The fire in front of the face is the only one that holds, but even the most well-made fireplace only warms the area in front of it. 2 feet away, it's already cool. 3 feet away, the air is immovable. At 5, there's a draft. The center of the room stays cold. The corners are icy, and everyone knows it. Most rooms have no fireplaces at all. Corridors, staircases, passages, gods, rooms, storerooms, kitchens, even refectories. All of these are freezing. And to keep warm, fireplaces are used. A roster is a portable bowl of charcoal, metal ceramic, rarely stone, sometimes with a handle, sometimes on legs. It doesn't burn, it smolders. You put coals from the hearth in it, cover it with ashes, put a lid on it. You put it at your feet under the table by the headboard. Sometimes they keep it on their knees wrapped in a cloth. In Prussia, Bohemia, and northern France, they use roasters in the form of clay bowls inserted into a metal holder. In Scandinavia, special forge baskets with lids. In Russia, warming pots, which were placed under the bed or sewn into sheepskin sacks. But roasters are dangerous. Coals can spill out, smoke can build up, carbon monoxide can go odorless. That's why you don't leave them unattended. They don't keep them closed. Sometimes a stone was put under the roster so as not to burn the floor. Sometimes they put it in a basin with sand. Rowers don't warm a room. They heat a point, one where a person sits. Everything else freezes. And even in a room with a fireplace, a roster could be used for feet, or to warm a bowl, or put it in bed an hour before bedtime. Fryers were everywhere. The cooks had them in the kitchen. The guards had them by the entrance. The maids had them in the pantry. They were carried from room to room, sometimes one per floor, sometimes one for three. The nobles lived differently. They had a fireplace, sometimes two. If the castle was rich, even in the bathroom if it was very rich in the guest bedroom, but even they couldn't heat the whole house. The castle wasn't heated. The castle was a local defense, like an organism in which blood flows only to the heart and fingers freeze. The stone walls don't warm. The hearth is failing. The staircases are drafty. And yet you can survive in a castle, because it not only resists the cold, it redirects it, atomizes. It holds it back. Architecture is like a shield, invisible but precise. Nothing here is random. The corridors are narrow. The flights are short. Staircases are twisted. Rooms are divided by arches, turns, niches. All this is not only for protection from the enemy, but also from the air. The castle is broken by the wind. It keeps the cold air from gaining strength. Spiral staircases, a symbol of castle architecture, are also a way to fight drafts. As air rises up such a staircase, it loses inertia. Every turn is an obstacle. Every ledge is a break. Cold moves slowly. Heat takes longer. Even one torch on such a ladder can change the feeling of winter. Narrow hallways and solid doors are another tool. Doors are put in a lot, sometimes unnecessarily, just to block the flow. Fabric curtains, wooden barriers, vestibules between rooms. All of these shut the building from the inside and makes the castle not a single cold hall, but many pockets, some freezing, others discreetly warm. Thick walls of castles, especially of early Norman and Romanesque castles, are not only defense, but also thermo-inertia. On average, the wall thickness in the main towers, dungeon, was 2 to 3 amp. Stone takes a long time to gain heat, but it also cools down slowly. If the room is warmed up even a little, the wall will keep this temperature for hours. This was especially evident in small living quarters, where heat was retained in layers from the inner partition to the wall, from the wall to the outer masonry. The farther away from the outside cold, the more stable the air. Small rooms inside the large halls were another trick. In the castle, they were often called closets, chambers, cabinets. They were spaces separated by curtains, wooden partitions, and canopies. They were used for sleeping, praying, eating. Space was reduced to a minimum, and it was easier to keep warm. Even a candle burning in such an enclosed corner raised the temperature by several degrees. Historical descriptions of castles such as Beaumais's Lache, Marburg, and Malberg indicate that many of them had narrow passages in the thickness of the walls, warm staircases, auxiliary galleries that could be used to pass between rooms without getting into the main draft. These were buffer zones, a kind of thermal airlocks. The location of the kitchen was especially important. They tried to put it on the lower level closer to the living quarters. Sometimes the wall of the bedroom or dining room was adjacent to the kitchen masonry, and the residual heat was transmitted through it. In Russia and Germany, there were foundations with embedded clay pipes that carried hot air from the stove under the floor. In the 15th century, some castles had special warm halls, small rooms well insulated, upholstered in wood or cloth, with a fireplace and one or two doors. Reading meetings and recreation were organized there. The rest of the castle was freezing, but this room was kept warm and stable. Yet these architectural measures didn't make the castle warm. They made it tolerable. They cut off the cold, kept out the wind, trapped warm air. In the center, where people lived, ate, slept. It wasn't heating. It was taming the elements through walls, doors, corners. A medieval castle is not a cozy place. It's an ordeal. The beauty of the towers and halls turned into harsh winters, dampness, heavy air, and a constant battle against the cold. People survived within these walls not because they were warm, but because they knew how to keep their bodies warm. If you want to know more about living in stone amidst darkness and drafts, subscribe to the channel. Here we tell the story as it was felt on the skin, in the lungs, and in the silence from which castles were built.